Welcome to Occultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. In this episode, I will go through the book Not by Chance by Dr. Lee Spetner. Before I go into it, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications if you want to get notified when I put out a new video. Like the video, share the video, and comment on the video if you want to say something or comment on the topic. So, Not by Chance by Dr. Lee Spetner. First, the edition is by the Judaica Press, 1998. Dr. Lee Spetner is a PhD from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in physics. But he's dedicated a lot of his life to the research and the study of biophysics and biology in general as well. Now, this book is about the theory of evolution. He's basically debunking a lot of the myths and a lot of the false presuppositions contained in the neo-Darwinian theory, as he calls it. So it's kind of cool to read a book that is breaking the mold when it comes to a lot of the accepted dogma in the modern scientific milieu, because most modern people tend to accept popular theories instead of keeping an open mind, which is actually a more scientific way of thinking. So the book is a really good one to kind of break through some of the cobwebs in the mind of most people. So even for that purpose, I think you enjoy the book. So I'm going to go through a couple of the points that I think might enhance your perception of the book and might entice you to get the book. So the first point, though, that I want to place here is that most people accept the progressivist evolutionary presupposition. They basically assume that it is true that things evolve, advance, progress from point A to point B. And this actually comes from a Christian Abrahamic presupposition. In other words, most people that started accepting scientism as a replacement for Christianity in the West only replaced the externals of their religion, but they didn't really replace the presuppositions of their religion. This happens with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, in which he seems to reject basic tenets of Christianity for his own naturalism, but within his naturalism, you can clearly detect a Christian presupposition. Similarly, with the theory of evolution, with the neo-Darwinian theory, they have simply replaced Christianity and added this new idea of an eschatological sequence of events that leads humanity from a primitive animal-like stage to a divine, highly advanced, intelligent, evolved being. So even from the start, I've always had some kind of distrust for the neo-Darwinian theory, simply because it seemed to be very, very close to a Christian presupposition, which doesn't exist in other systems. So you don't see this presupposition applied, for example, in India, where you did have minds that discussed and speculated on things like the source of human beings and biology, but the presupposition was not Abrahamic, and therefore it was not linear. It contained basic presuppositions connected to the dharmic conception of time, which is circular. So a couple data points in the book. Random mutations do not add information. They actually diminish genetic information. So that's a key point in which he is basing his entire work, is that people assume or think, or most people don't even think about this, but what I'm saying is that because the entire theory of evolution neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is based on random mutations and mutations in general, that everything is a mutation, then people would blindly assume that mutations add information. Because if they don't add information, there's no progression or evolution. But what he's pointing out is that mutations usually diminish information, which is the opposite effect that people would assume. Another aspect of the Darwinian presupposition that he is critiquing is that species are always on the verge of disaster. This is something you'll see in The Origin of Man, which is this notion that all beings all animals, all creatures are always on that edge of being wiped out, on the edge of exhausting their land and exhausting their resources. And Darwin calls that, the verge of disaster, on the edge of disaster. But what Dr. Spetner is saying is that in using a lot of data, a lot of research and study, is that usually animals actually keep their populations under control and do not overburden their resources to zero. They don't push their environments to an absolute level of destruction. So man seems to be the one that hunts animals all the way to extinction, for example. Most animals will not do this, and they will keep their populations that they're hunting, if they're predatory animals, under control. It even goes into plants, that plants don't overburden land to such an extreme in which they're on the verge of disaster. So that's another precept that is interesting. And there's a psychological component in there too, because a lot of social Darwinism is predicated on this presupposition. But if you remove that presupposition, then it changes the perspective, even the political perspective that stems from social Darwinism. Another aspect, the idea that higher organisms don't necessarily have more chromosomes. So again, the idea that evolution or progression implies more genetic code, more DNA, more chromosomes, meaning higher being, higher levels, etc. And he's kind of tearing that down and stating actually amount of DNA or amount of chromosomes, actually he discusses both, do not imply higher organisms. For example, dogs and the silkworm have more chromosomes. They don't necessarily qualify as higher organisms per se. So that's another idol, if you will, that is being knocked down. Also, he discusses the fact that for you to be able to have an improvement of a species in the mode of neo-Darwinism, it would require several correlated adaptations to occur simultaneously together. So obviously, this makes it very, very difficult because it would require a lot of random mutations, so-called, to occur at the same time. The odds of that are pretty low. And that's the other thing. The Darwinian conception also has a metaphysical presupposition in there. The metaphysical presupposition is that creatures are impacted by an environment, for example, and then they mutate to adapt to this change. But the presupposition there, the metaphysical one, is that there is a mind of some sort that can alter entire systems, meaning like an entire body or elements of a body, to adapt to a situation. So there's water, and then there's a mind that says there's water, we need to add fins, and we need to adjust to a methodology of breathing. If you notice, it's not actually unthinking and random, because unthinking random mutations would not work. That's not how organisms work. They don't just happen randomly. There is a directed evolutionary conception in the Darwinian theory, is what I'm saying. And of course, Darwin was a theist. Darwin was not an atheist. So Darwin is assuming that even though this is by natural selection, there's a selection that is occurring in a kind of mind that is kind of hovering above each species. And this notion of adaptation for improvement is a metaphysical presupposition. It's not really random. if it's adapting to improve. The notion of improvement itself is metaphysical, is my point. Another point, because most mutations are harmful and random, then how can they be based on the needs of a population? So again, what I just said, needs. This conception is a metaphysical conception. It's a philosophical conception that a species has a need, and this need is somehow fulfilled by randomness. There's a conundrum there that is pretty clear. Now, to me, the best and actually the most interesting element of Dr. Spetner's book is his entire discussion on odds. He goes into the mathematics of this, in which he compares the odds of every single aspect of the evolutionary theory working together in a way that would make the theory work, and he puts it at the level of beyond impossible. So he puts an impossible odds example, and then he places the odds, he does the numbers on the theory of Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution, and he comes to the conclusion that it's beyond impossible for those things to actually occur. So he dismisses it mathematically. And readers should go and just that entire section is actually very, very cool because of the examples he gives. And even though it's very technical, if you can dedicate the time to grasp the point, it will really, I think, put your mind really at a place where you can start to understand why the modern scientific world is in a state of dogmatic limbo, because it's now falling into the trap of being its own religion. Scientism is a form of religion, unfortunately. But of course, this book is a great example of plenty of thinkers that are willing to go outside the box. So that's a wonderful thing. And finally, the last point I would like to bring is that evolution obviously depends on random events that somehow have a directed purpose, even though the loss of information would imply the opposite. So, evolution and progressivism assumes higher levels of information, higher levels of adaptation, more complex organisms, etc. But all the scientific evidence is that mutations diminish information, and therefore there's no such thing as a linear kind of inevitable dialectic of evolution. And that's what I've always found interesting about Darwinism, is that Darwinism and Marxism and even Adam Smith's theory of capitalism, they all have the Darwinian conception in there. So a lot of these political theories, both capitalism and Marxism, etc., they have a Darwinian precept. And the Darwinian precept is about an evolution, like an inevitable path towards evolution and progression. But when you realize that the Darwinian conception of a thought out, kind of directed evolution is not necessarily true, it actually knocks the legs off almost every single political theory that is predicated upon Darwinian evolution. And it would require people to actually, in my opinion, reassess most political theories, because their underpinnings are actually more than likely incorrect. At least that thought came as I went through the book, and it's a very important thing to consider. So I'm going to close the review by reading a quote. And the reason I'm doing this is because I think because a lot of people, what they're going to say is, okay, so what's the alternative? What's his proposal? Now, of course, he discusses this throughout the book. So you're going to have to read the book to get that information. But I will quote at least a paragraph that I think will give you a taste of his theory. Quote, "I am suggesting here that organisms have a built-in capability of adapting to their environment. I am suggesting that to the extent that evolution occurs, it occurs at the level of the organism. This suggestion differs sharply from the thesis of the NDT, which holds that evolution occurs only at the level of the population. Organisms contain within themselves the information that enables them to develop a phenotype adaptive to a variety of environments. The adaptation can occur by a change in the genome through a genetic change triggered by the environment, or it can occur without any genetic change. This capability is an advantage to the population. It helps it survive by adapting to long-term changes in the environment. End of quote. So here's basically saying, look, if a biological engineer was designing a living organism, he could give it a range. He knows that his species or his creature is going to be, I'm talking from his perspective, is going to be confronted by a variety of environments. So he has a design dilemma, basically. He has to decide, do I make him highly, highly adaptive, but to a point in which he cannot be fully functional in one single environment in a very successful way? Or do I just grant them some adaptive capability that is already within the genetic code? It doesn't require a mutation that loses information. The information is already in the gene. So basically his main theory, his main notion here is that somehow or other, and it could be from the perspective of a creationist, placed in the genetic code the capacity to adapt to environments to allow the species to be able to survive in a more efficient way. So you can take that as you want. That is the basic perspective. But again, I highly recommend the book. I think there's only a paperback available, but get any edition you can, and I think you'll enjoy the book, and I think at least will give you perspectives. I have a lot of books that are pro-Darwinian evolution, a lot of books are against it. There are a lot of books actually against it as well from reputable people. So always read both sides of the story here, and you can get to your own conclusions, of course. So hopefully you enjoyed the review. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Click like if you like the video. Share the video and comment on the video. And I'll be more than happy to engage with you there. So thank you for joining me. See you next time.